They came for Canada's oil. Canada said no. They came for the uranium. Canada said no. They came for the potash, the natural gas, the electricity. No, no, no. This morning, the United States came for something far more dangerous to touch. They came for the wheat, the crop that feeds billions. And Mark Carney just looked Washington in the eye and said no again, this time in front of the entire world. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we cover this story every single day and you do not want to be the last person to know what happens next. Here is what most people are not understanding yet. This was not a trade request. What the United States Department of Agriculture and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative filed this morning was a 4-point demand document, and every single point was designed to do one thing: strip Canada of control over its own grain and hand the keys to Washington. Condition 1. American grain buyers get first priority on Canadian wheat shipments, ahead of every other country currently buying from Canada. Countries in the Middle East, countries across Africa, countries in South and Southeast Asia, nations where Canadian wheat is not a commercial preference. It is the difference between eating and not eating. Condition 2. Canada must scrap its own grain grading system, a system refined over more than 100 years, and replace it with American standards. Think about what that means. The quality framework that makes Canadian wheat the most desired grain on the planet, built to serve global buyers, would be dismantled to serve American preferences. Condition 3. American officials would gain input over Canadian wheat pricing. Not suggestions, input. Structural involvement in what Canada charges for its own grain on its own land. Condition 4. Canadian grain ports, milling facilities, and grain storage networks. The physical infrastructure of Canadian food production would be open to American corporate investment through structures that had never been negotiated and were never agreed to. Read those 4 conditions together slowly, and you see exactly what this is. It is not a trade proposal. It is a takeover blueprint dressed in trade language. And here is what you need to stay for, because what happened next is the part that will define the next decade of global food politics. At 1:29 this afternoon, Mark Carney walked out in Ottawa. He was not alone. Flanking him were Canada's Minister of Agriculture and the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations World Food Programme. The moment that second figure stepped into frame, every journalist in that room understood. This reply was not going to be addressed to Washington. It was going to be addressed to the world. Carney opened without hesitation. Canada had reviewed the joint request. Canada's answer was no. Then he did something no one in that room fully anticipated. He did not just reject the 4 conditions. He turned each one into an indictment. On American priority over other nations' food supply. Canada will not place American commercial preferences above the food security of countries that rely on Canadian wheat to feed their people. Not for any trade benefit, not under any pressure, not inside any structure Washington might construct around it. On replacing Canada's grading standards. The system was not built to block American access. It was built to make Canadian wheat the most trusted grain in the world. Dismantling it to match American preferences would destroy the very quality reputation that makes every buyer, including American buyers, want Canadian wheat in the first place. On American pricing involvement. Canada sets prices for Canadian assets through Canadian market processes. Outside pricing control is not a trade deal. It is economic occupation. Canada's answer is the same one it has given every time this pattern has appeared. No. On foreign corporate access to Canadian farming infrastructure, grain ports, milling plants, storage networks. These are not investment opportunities to be unlocked through trade pressure. They are national systems. They stay under Canadian control. Full stop. Now stay with us here, because Carney did not stop at rejection. He moved. Canada formally delivered its wheat supply commitment framework to the United Nations World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization, locking its food security promises to at-risk nations into the international record as protected national obligations, not diplomatic signals, legal standing with international bodies. Canada announced the completion of 5-year wheat supply agreements with 7 countries across the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Agreements that had been in negotiation for months and were finalized and announced today, precisely because Washington's demand created the political moment to publicly lock those partnerships in permanently. Canada activated a national agricultural control framework through the Canada Grain Commission, directing that all future grain distribution decisions be evaluated first against Canadian food security duties, international humanitarian commitments, and national economic priorities, before any single buyer's request from any country at any economic scale is considered. This is the part of the story no headline is capturing clearly enough. The demand that was designed to guarantee American access to Canadian wheat has instead triggered a chain of Canadian policy decisions that will structurally reduce American access to Canadian wheat for years. Global grain markets responded immediately. Canadian wheat futures climbed as the long-term supply agreements with international partners created pricing stability and supply certainty across non-American markets. American grain buyers watching this develop started calling their senators. Senators from farming states started making calls of their own. The political pressure loop that has broken every earlier version of this administration's resource strategy is spinning up again, faster this time, because wheat is not abstract. Voters understand bread. The World Food Programme responded with a formal statement of support for Canada's commitment framework. Governments across North Africa, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa released statements of gratitude. Canada's rejection of a two-country demand became, within hours, a multilateral moment watched by every government that sells food, buys food, or worries about who controls the systems that move food around the planet. 3 scenarios are now in play. In the first, the domestic American political cost of reduced Canadian wheat access, combined with global attention on the humanitarian framing of Canada's rejection, forces the administration to drop the wheat demand within 30 days, and Canada's newly secured international supply agreements become permanent commercial relationships that were always coming, just accelerated by Washington's overreach. In the second, the administration escalates with targeted tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports. Canada responds with counter tariffs on American farm products, calibrated precisely to hit the farming states whose senators are already under pressure. The economic pain on the American side of that exchange outpaces anything earlier stages of this dispute produced. Resolution comes within 60 days under conditions far less favorable to Washington than today's starting point. In the third, Canada's formal commitments to international food bodies and its long-term supply partnerships with food-insecure nations create a structural shift in how Canadian agricultural trade is organized globally, one that outlasts this dispute entirely. Canada exits this conflict not merely having defended its position, but having deepened its role as the world's most trusted grain supplier, embedded in international food security architecture in ways that no future bilateral pressure from any direction can easily unwind. Every slice of bread tells a story. This morning, the most powerful government on earth tried to rewrite Canada's chapter of that story, tried to insert American commercial priority as the first claim on Canadian grain, ahead of every hungry nation that depends on it. Mark Carney refused, calmly, publicly, permanently, with the United Nations watching and the international record updated before Washington could frame it any other way. Canadian wheat feeds the world. Canada decides who gets it, when they get it, what they pay, and under what terms. That is not a negotiating position. That is sovereignty. And today, in front of the planet, Canada defended it once more, on the issue where the stakes are most human, most direct, and most impossible to spin. We track every development on this story daily, not weekly, not when it's convenient, every single day. Hit subscribe so you never fall behind on what's coming next. If this breakdown gave you something most coverage missed, share it with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Washington will back down, escalate, or has Canada already won this round before the next move is made? Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.